Okay, there's a general election on the horizon, and this is really important election for the laws surrounding sex work. Advocates of the Swedish model think that this is their moment. This is their moment that they can bring about a change that they want, which is to criminalise the purchase of sex, because essentially they don't like sex work. They have a moral objection to sex work, and they don't care about the evidence. They don't care that in Sweden, sex workers are at more risk of harm, they're more stigmatised, and far less likely to report to the police or engage with services. Politicians have a moral duty, they have a responsibility not to mislead people, whether willingly or by their own ignorance. Mary Honeyball is incredibly frustrating, and she cares not about the evidence, but she cares about ideology, and it's really dangerous. And it's not just Mary Honeyball. Fiona McTaggart's the same, Rhoda Grant's the same. I was at an event with Rhoda Grant where she was putting out completely inaccurate portrayals of sex work, and it's really frustrating for me as someone who spent so much time working in politics trying to actually make a change and make a difference, that these politicians, because they're so hell-bent on enacting legislation that supports their ideology, and their ideology based on a personal dislike for sex work, they perpetuate myths and stereotypes, they stigmatise sex workers, and essentially they use statistics that either they know to be false, or if they don't know to be false, then they don't know anything about this subject, they don't know anything at all about this subject that they talk about so often.
In fact, the statistics tell us that out of brothels and women who are prostituted in London, over 90% of them actually have been trafficked. And the majority of women who work in prostitution have either been trafficked or have been brought to work as prostitutes. Over 90% of them have been trafficked, so it is a huge problem.
I'm shaking my head because that just is not the case. All the evidence that I've received, open evidence that I've received for the production of this report and the previous report, indicates that it's nowhere near that number of people are trafficked into brothels. In fact, the majority of people who are working in brothels are not trafficked, very clearly are not trafficked. The Metropolitan Police were given £500,000 before the Olympics in order to find these victims of trafficking. In that period, they found the same number as they did in the year before.
In Sweden, where sex work is criminalised, the purchase of sex is criminalised, it's been pushed further underground. And if something's pushed further underground, then surely it's much harder to detect any criminal activity within that. So it's spectacularly naive to suggest that by criminalising the purchase of sex, trafficking within sex will just disappear. No, it won't. It'll be shoved further underground, and it'll be far harder for authorities to detect. Jay Levy's research on Sweden found that clients of sex workers will be far less likely to report to the police if they saw an exploited woman than they would prior to the criminalising of the purchase of sex, because that individual is criminalised. So why would they go to the police? It's too much of a risk for them. And And interestingly, what always frustrates me, we've had so much support, National Ugly Mugs, from politicians trying to help us get funding, trying to support our work, speaking about us, and that support from across political parties, many politicians of many ideologies, you know, from Andrew Boff, Tory, to Kate Green, Labour Party, to Lynn Featherstone, the Lib Dem, really support what we do. And yet, Fiona McTaggart, Mary Honeyball, Rhoda Grant, they're politicians who talk about sex work all the time. It's like an obsession. They talk about the safety of women, but none of them have ever come forth to support National Ugly Mugs. We've asked for their support. None of them have done anything to support National Ugly Mugs. So if they cared so much about sex workers and about sex workers' welfare, then don't you think they'd support a practical, non-ideological safety, harm reduction? But the crucial point is whether people have negative experiences of sex work or not, whether they're exploited or not, criminalising the purchase of sex will only drive it underground, as has happened in Sweden, and will make it far less safe for sex workers. So I guess this is a rallying call, a rallying cry for people to write to their MPs and find out what their views are on sex work. Write to Ed Miliband, write to Yvette Cooper and say the Swedish model will harm sex workers. Do not even consider it.
When consenting adults are having sex, that is none of the state's business.